We appreciate you joining us here. My name is Tommy Schultz. I'm the Vice President of Communications and Marketing for the American Federation for Children. We have with us Halli Faulkner, our Director of Research, Director of National Policy, but I also view her as our Research Director in so many ways. John Schilling, President of the American Federation for Children, and Emily Ekins, the Director of Polling for the Cato Institute. So we're here to talk about polling, messaging, new things that have happened on the federal landscape. I think we'll just jump right into this and go to John to talk about gear funds. So John, you wrote a paper and published it at AEI titled "How States Can Use CARES Act Funds to Promote and Support Educational Choice." So would love for you to summarize it for us. Maybe a lot of folks haven't heard about what happened on the CARES Act, some might have, but would love to hear kind of your summary, get a sense of what states followed your playbook and which states you hope will follow the playbook.
Well, thanks, Tommy. So back on March 27th, as you all know, the president signed at the time was the third COVID relief bill, the CARES Act, which was the largest federal relief package ever at over $2 trillion. And included in this huge bill was $16.2 billion for education. And it included $3 billion for something called the Governor's Emergency Education Relief Fund, GEAR funds, which is something that we've all become familiar with over these last several months. And I would add, sadly, a lot of this money remains unspent, which is another issue. But there were a lot of governors who really took the bull by the horns here and did some really interesting things. In South Carolina, Governor McMaster designated $32 million to create something called the Safe Grants Program. And these grants would have supported private school tuition for students and households at 300% or less of poverty. It was a great idea. Sadly, the opponents sued and blocked the program, and the South Carolina Supreme Court sided against the governor and families. There may be a rehearing on this at some point, but we'll see about that. Oklahoma Governor Kevin Stitt launched something called a Stay in School Funds program, which provided emergency relief to families of private school students hit hard by the pandemic. Florida Governor Ron DeSantis, big school choice champion, invested $30 million in the tax credit scholarship program. Also made a $15 million investment in the stabilization funds to provide grants directly to private schools that serve low-income kids. Governor Sununu in New Hampshire provided $1.5 million to scholarship organizations that participate in their tax credit scholarship program. And in North Carolina, the Republican-led state legislature expanded their Opportunity Scholarship program. So these were all really great things that governors did. And, these are just some of the specific choice things that governors did. But there were governors all over the country who used these GEAR funds to really do some new and innovative things that benefited families. And, and it was really important that Congress did this. And it was just as important that Congress did not impose a lot of regulations on how governors could expend these funds.
Yeah, and you talked about those states that did things. We've got, as you mentioned, some unspent money here going into the the rest of this year and even beginning of next year. What's kind of the timelines of how and when they can spend that money? Give us a sense of that too.
So the funds needed to be committed before the end of this year, but they had up to 2 years to spend the funds. Now, as I think everybody knows, COVID relief negotiations are once again percolating. So there may be some changes to this. Maybe they will change the rules and say that they have a little bit longer to commit the funds and a little bit longer to actually spend the funds.
Got it. And I'll turn it over to Halli. Halli, would love to get your take on what you felt was probably the most surprising thing that we learned about GEAR funds.
I think we're all still in the process of learning. My own face just got really big on my screen when I started talking, which is very startling.
It is startling at the beginning, but you get used to it.
Yeah, I'm just like talking to my own face right now. I think we're all still in the process of learning not just about gear funds, but also about, as John mentioned, this like unprecedented, which I think is the word of 2020, relief package, and how to make the most of it, in education policy and healthcare policy and food policy, etc. In education in particular, I am surprised that, as John mentioned, $3 billion was set aside for the gear fund, so the governor's discretionary funds, and only 2.2 billion of that has actually been applied for and allocated to the states. So there's like $700-800 million waiting to be used. And I know that state leaders in particular, as are all government officials right now, are under a lot of pressure to take care of their constituents. But if it were me, if I was the policy person in a governor's office, I would be pushing my governor to apply for a bit more funding. The gear funding is allocated based on the school age population in the state, so like K-12 population per state. So some states have applied for and received the maximum allocation, but there are plenty of states that haven't yet. Yeah. So it's always surprising to me when there's unused money on the table.
Sure. And were there, in your sense too, like other surprising ways that the money hasn't been used currently, or even if you want to touch upon some of the creative ways governors have used it or should use it further beyond what John kind of just mentioned?
Yeah. I think a lot of people, like when I talk about education policy with groups who are new to education policy, are often surprised that, if you look per school, for example, only about 10% of the funding comes from the federal government. The vast majority of funding per school comes from state and local funds. And as a policy person, sometimes I think about, like, what is the role of the federal government, not to get too meta here, but what is the role of the federal government in education policy, or what should it be? And I really personally like what the US DOE did under Arne Duncan, which is like the carrot approach, right? So like, if you do all these cool things, then we'll give you a bunch of extra money, which I think was more popular than No Child Left Behind, although I do think No Child Left Behind definitely served an important role. But I mentioned that because, there are a few states like Maryland and Arizona that have used part of their gear funds to set up like competitive grants. So these are grants that schools apply for. Any schools can apply for them. So zone public school, magnet school, charter public school, private school, any type of school. And, as long as they submit a plan to use the funding in innovative ways to meet student needs and family needs, then they can get a little pot of money, like a micro grant, which I just think is cool because, as we all know, I feel like our whole education system just got thrown into a tumbler, and we definitely haven't stopped tumbling yet. So I think until things start to settle down, this is the time for schools to try new things and just see what works and have extra support for that.
Sure. What other types of reforms could we see? And this could be, we can open it to John or to Halli for that round of CARES Act funding. Do you see where, hey, this could be used not only for private school choice, could this be used for public school choice? I know some states have had any number of kind of grant proposals. What do you find interesting there? What other avenues could still be exercised, do you think, now that we're a few months into it?
Well, I think there's a lot of avenues. They can be used for such a wide array of things: hybrid homeschooling, tutoring, education technology, learning pod expenses. I think what we want to do, what we are certainly advocating here at AFC, is that we want governors to be thinking outside the box. What we know from this pandemic is that we have a lot of very anxious parents of school-age children all over America who have but one thing in mind: and what is it that I can do to ensure that my child gets a full-time quality education? And that's where these gear funds could really come in handy for families. We just need governors to really think outside the box.
Yeah, I agree, John. I think that one way that governors, legislators, etc., can start to think about what to do over the next year in the upcoming legislative session and with federal funds is to start talking to families more, to parents more. I know a lot of, policy folks are parents themselves, myself included. But for me as a policy person, I'm on all these calls when everyone's like, oh, it's a time to be bold, it's a time to be innovative. But like, I actually don't hear that many specifics about like what that actually means and like what that's going to look like over the next few years. And I think the way that we get more concrete ideas is by talking to parents and finding out like, okay, if you had the choice for your kids to go back to school full-time or part-time, which would you choose? What are the parts of this like pandemic learning that have worked for you? What are the parts that haven't worked? How is your view on education changed? Like if you had more funding, like $5,000 more in your kids' education, what would you use it for? And I think that's the way that we as policy folks can start to envision these like innovative ideas, is by really asking parents and even students, right, if they're old enough, like what do they need and what do they want, and how can the system start transforming to serve them better?
Well, speaking of keeping an open phone line to parents, I think I'm the only one here who actually isn't a parent, so I'm probably less qualified to talk about some of those issues. But speaking of another parent on this call who I think has a lot of insights both on research and surveys, as Halli might have even been suggesting. Emily, I'd love to get your take on a slide that I'll try and put up here, which talks about what we've just been going through, the GEARS funds. So, we asked in a poll in conjunction with Real Clear Politics this past August, hey, look, recent federal legislation gave governors new funding that they can use for K-12 education. Some governors will let families control the funds to purchase education technology, materials, tuition, home education. Would you support your governor sending direct funding directly to families and allowing them to utilize those funds? And I mean, overall, 67% support. Public school parents, I mean, this is the kicker here, right? I mean, 78% saying that they're supporting that. Millennials, African Americans, Latinos, all staggeringly high levels of support. Emily, if you've probably advised governors and national policymakers, and you think about these issues deeply. When you're seeing numbers like that, where it's like 78% of parents are saying, "Give me money and let me use it to customize education," and even personally as a parent, what are your takes?
Right. Well, when you see a big discrepancy between what people say they want and what we're actually seeing in kind of the policy world, a lot of that has to do with the fact that the interest groups that mediate between the voters and the politicians do not align with how voters feel. And I think that that's what we're seeing here, is where, the overwhelming majority of parents with children in school are sending their kids to public school. I think it's like about 80%. But if you ask people where they'd prefer to send their kids, I think it's 70% would prefer to send their kids to some non-public school, whether that be private, parochial, charter, something like that. And what we're seeing here is a unique opportunity. And I hope that this is one that people really make the most of. Right now, we're in the midst of a crisis, and a lot of parents feel that the public schooling system is not flexible enough to meet the demands to educate our nation's children properly. We're seeing article after article coming out of mainstream news sites about how children are not able to learn nearly as well on virtual school. The widening gaps and inequities between various groups of students. So people, I think, are really much more interested now, because it's so real and concrete. Much more interested now into making real change. The data that you showed there, 78% support having more choice over where they send their kids. The number that I really pay attention to is where Democrats. What Democrats are thinking about school choice, because if you ask Republicans and independents, for a long time, they've been, very much on board. This seems like a great idea to them. Democrats are a little bit more reluctant. And part of the reason is that they're afraid that if we take money and spend it, allow students to go where they want to go for school, where their parents want them to go, that could mean less resources available for the other students in public school. And so what we're seeing now are opportunities where it's not zero sum, it's positive sum. There's opportunities to allow the students who choose to remain in public school to get the best education they can, while also allowing kids the freedom to go somewhere else where maybe the educational opportunities will better fit their needs, especially right now. And so what I'm hoping to see is some bold action and change from people at the state level. This is the time, because parents right now are very stressed out with their kids at home, trying to teach their kids. I was talking to a friend the other day, and she says, I need worksheets. I cannot homeschool my kids by myself. This is horrible. Parents are overwhelmed. They're having to work full time and educate their children. Even though many of them are, plugged into virtual school during the day, a lot of parents are reporting that their kids just aren't really staying on task. It's so much easier to start playing a computer game on their computer or be text messaging with their friends. And so they have to police them and make sure they're paying attention. But I've got to tell you, my friends whose kids are going to some sort of private or parochial school, their kids are back in the classroom following rigorous safety measures. There are some risks associated with that the parents have been willing to make, many of these parents have been willing to make. So if that's the case, given this current situation, now's the time for bold change to really shake things up, because if special interest groups protest these changes, they're going to look really bad in this moment when parents are in desperate need for their kids to have a good outlet to be able to gain high quality education.
Emily isn't even a full-time professional education reform advocate, and she certainly is. She's on point with her messaging, I think. Well, and I'd love to get other discussion here too, whether Halli and John. We all want bold action. I think in light of, I'll show another quick slide on polling here, where we saw a 10-point jump this year from April to August in support for the concept of school choice. So this is even specific nitty-gritty. This is just the concept of school choice. From April, it went from 67% support from public school parents to August, 77% support. We really do have a moment in time where I think we can get some pretty big things done. We'd love to get some of your general commentary. Emily, you I think you hit the nail on the head pretty well, but John or Halli, Halli, you brought up, hey, if I was an advisor to a governor, what would I do? John, you've worked in state level education. Would love to get some of your thoughts there too on how you might proceed in this current moment.
Well, practically speaking, I've heard a few states, like Arizona is one of them, talking about creating a new education savings account program. And with the idea of money follows the kid, right? And as John mentioned, a lot of the COVID response kind of programs or relief packages in education have been specifically either specifically prioritize students from low-income families, or are just limited to students from low-income families. And I do think that in these times, like in Arizona, for example, it's a good strategy. It's a good moderate strategy, because, especially because so many families are experiencing financial difficulties right now, to, create a program that gives parents more funding, gives them more education flexibility, and is, specifically directs those funds to low-income families.
Yeah, Emily alluded to this, Halli just touched on it. Flexibility is really the key here. I'm grateful for a lot of things in the midst of this horrible crisis. One of them is that my children are grown and I don't have to deal with this. But I have talked with a lot of families here in Fairfax County, which has been a disaster in terms of their ability to deliver full-time education to the kids. We have to remember some obvious things here. Traditional public school students lost about 3 months of the last school year because too many school districts proved incapable of delivering online education. And who suffers most? Well, I mean, the ones who suffer most are special needs children who desperately need in-person instruction, and children in lower income families, about 30% of whom lack the necessary technology to do remote learning. This is a real problem, and flexibility is really the key. And I think whatever states can do to increase, the purchasing power of families, whatever states can do to directly empower them. That's why education savings accounts are so great. I mean, there's a menu of options that families can use these funds for to meet the very specific needs of their child. I mean, that's really that is really the key here, is increasing the flexibility in a system that is obviously antiquated.
Tommy,
and John, or go ahead, Emily. Yeah.
Sorry, please finish that thought.
Now,
I was going to kick it over to a new topic, so I'd love to have you, if you want to weigh in.
Oh, I have more to say about this. So, I don't work primarily in education policy. I do polling more generally. And so I'm looking at this data with fresh eyes, just thinking about what do we typically see in polling. And I have to report to you that this shift that you measured, I'm not sure if you can show it again on the screen, but that big jump between April and August, that's just 4 months. To see a 10 percentage point increase in 4 months in support for school choice is tremendously high. That is a very uncommon thing in public polling for you to see a trend like this. Typically, when pollsters think about big trends, it's like over a 10-year period, things went up maybe 10 to 15 percentage points, not 4 months. And clearly, this is the public responding to a very serious, national and global crisis. And people are in desperate need trying to find solutions for their children where they're able to protect the health and safety of their family and those around them, but also their kids not having, permanent damage for the rest of their lives because they weren't able to receive a proper education during these very important formative years. So when I look at this data here, I see a huge opportunity for very dramatic reform. I think it's time to stop doing kind of small things, but something more dramatic. If as many kids as possible were offered the opportunity, if their parents desire to get into a new school environment that best fits their needs and balances the needs of public safety, public health, the better. Because then in the future, after this pandemic, hopefully we're able to overcome it. We have a vaccine that becomes widely available. A lot of these students have an opportunity, and their parents have a chance to compare the experiences that they had in the new schools that they were able to attend versus the schools they were in before. And they might not want to go back. This might really offer an opportunity for lasting, long-lasting change. And the other number, I don't know, Tommy, if you were planning to go here, were you planning to go into the scholarship data and how that support for scholarships has increased? That also really stood out to me, but I'll wait if that was something you wanted to discuss later.
Yeah, we can maybe dive into that a bit later. But
sorry, just one other thing, Emily, as you were talking, and Tommy, I don't think we need the slide again, but the first thing is in April, right, we were only home with our kids for 1 month, so it was like a novelty. In August, we've been home with our kids for 5 months. We're like, yeah, we believe in school choice, like just get us to school. But along those lines, part of what this makes me think about, which is something I've thought about for a long time, working in education policy and now specifically AFC's focusing on school choice, is like, the fact that a lot of people who are quote unquote against school choice are the people who have never needed it before, right? So the people who can buy a house in like a neighborhood where their kids can walk to school safely, or who can, have the political power to advocate for a teacher for their kid that actually like teaches them. And so, it's just interesting to see such an increase in the parents that believe in school choice, because now so many more people need it.
Right. Well, speaking of, big things, big bold change, John, would love to get your take on kind of a different subject, but somewhat related, of a pretty significant movement and a pretty significant thing that never happened before, at the federal level. Over the summer, it began where we were making a pretty concerted effort to get support and to get a bill passed that would enable a huge facilitation of school choice at the state level. Would you kind of summarize kind of what happened there? Because I think this is a really significant piece of legislation, and I think, as you kind of alluded to earlier, might be picking up steam again here in the next 2 weeks.
Let's hope. Well, as we talked about, when this pandemic began and all of a sudden you had 55 million school children, K-12 school children who became instant homeschoolers, we knew that this was a serious challenge. And with the funds that were included in the CARES Act, it became clear as the pandemic continued and it worsened and the anxiety level among parents of school-age children continued to increase, that that more needed to be done. And the CARES Act did provide a lot of money for education. As Halli noted, a lot of it remains unspent. But a group of schools that are critical to our K-12 ecosystem were largely left out of this, and those were private schools. Private schools educate about 10% of the K-12 population. It saves the public system more than $75 billion annually. Yes, with a little bit of tap dancing, they were able to access some Paycheck Protection Program dollars and equitable services, which benefit some private schools, but a lot of private schools were and are struggling. And, the narrative that we typically get from the teachers union, a lot of the folks in the press and too many policymakers, is that private schools only educate kids from wealthy families. The reality is private schools educate more than 1.7 million children from lower income families. Some folks are now saying, well, private schools are experiencing a spike in enrollment because of the pandemic. Well, the reason some private schools are experiencing a spike in enrollment is because they work really hard to safely and responsibly open to educate children. But the influx has also brought greater responsibilities, greater challenges, and increased costs. They need help. And because of this horrible crisis, a lot of groups, AFC and a number of our national and state allies around the country spent the last 8 months, making this case that, we need to provide some support for non-public schools and families, and we need to figure out a way to increase flexibility for families that, whose public school systems are not delivering education. And we succeeded in getting 3 really important provisions into the Senate's 2 targeted bills. First was substantial aid for public and non-public schools who were equally affected by the pandemic. Second, with School Choice Now, this is a Tim Scott, Lamar Alexander, Ted Cruz bill for emergency tuition scholarships that are based on each state's private school enrollment prior to the pandemic. And a $5 billion federal tax credit that would provide scholarships for public and private school families for the next 2 years. These scholarships could be used for a menu of options: special needs services, education technology, private school tuition, tutoring, workforce training, among other uses. And of course, the third item is gear funds, additional gear funds for governors. And also, all 3 of these things were included in the Senate's targeted bills. Sadly, Democrats filibustered both of these bills. But the 2 cloture votes, for the first time ever, put a majority of the United States Senate in support of a new school choice offering that included private school tuition. This was a monumental achievement. Now, this will all be for naught, almost all for naught, unless these current COVID negotiations are going to include some of these provisions. But I think it's just really, really important that if there's going to be additional COVID relief, you want to make sure that the COVID relief is going to be applicable to all students, not just some, because every student in America has been affected by the pandemic equally.
Right, and I think as we think about future years, even this, monumental year in terms of that piece of legislation, the School Choice Now Act, and any other kind of form that it might take, as you've stated and others on our team have stated, this we are trying to strike while the iron is hot, for sure. But whether it's in any state that we're fighting in, sometimes it takes numerous iterations and many years to get it done. And so I know AFC will stay in the fight. And speaking of kind of future things, John, what's your take on what might happen with the DC OSP here in the next few years? The DC voucher program, you saw and were very intimately involved with some of the fights that, it and the challenges that it was facing a few years ago. Would love to get your perspective on what the kind of future outlook is like there.
Yeah, Tommy, I'm concerned, to be candid. The Obama-Biden administration was not supportive of the DC Opportunity Scholarship Program, and the Obama administration, their basic view was we will provide only enough funding to support children currently in the program, and no new funding for scholarships. And it was basically a wither on the vine approach, and it was really troubling because even when we managed to secure additional appropriations for the program, the Obama administration held those funds and would not allow them to be used for new scholarships. So I'm very concerned about this. Were it not for John Boehner, who held up the entire fiscal year 2011 budget until Obama agreed to reauthorize the DC Opportunity Scholarship Program, the program might be dead by now. So we're going to work really hard with the new administration. We're going to try to provide useful information to them about why this program is necessary, how it has worked over the last now almost 16 years, providing a high quality education for low-income families in Washington, D.C. It is one of the most studied federal education programs ever. And one of the things that we know from all of this study is that the kids who entered this program, more than 90% of them are 94% of them are graduating from high school, and almost 90% of them are going on to college. Well, that's a pretty darn successful program, and it's worthy of continued funding. So we're going to do whatever we can to educate the new administration about the program, about its successes, work with our allies in the House and the Senate to try to make sure that the program continues to get funded and hopefully grows.
And John, for further context I'm assuming we have a lot of advocates here that know some of these statistics, but I think the DC OSP, the student average family income is something like $21,000 per year. And yet, like you said, 90% are going to college and higher graduation rates. Emily, I'd love to get even your outsider's perspective, and Halli can weigh in too. But given, the new administration coming in, if there's this kind of narrative out there that says, hey, we want to be the party of the working class, we want to, take a look and help lower income families. It seems like school choice is, low hanging fruit for somebody, of any party to get on board with, to say this is the silver bullet. Is this new spike in polling that we're seeing giving us new opportunities there in the way that maybe there might be an analogy with whether it's criminal justice reform kind of getting done in the past couple of years? I know that's an open-ended question, but Emily, what would be your take, just given the strength of these polling numbers? Is there actually opportunities here to maybe get some, even at the state level, if not federal level, some big changes on a bipartisan way?
So I think that what can be a little bit tricky is the way interest groups interact with our political system, and that I'm not exactly sure what to expect. And what I mean by interest groups are various teacher groups that may feel differently about the school choice initiatives that groups part of this organization are advocating for. So they may oppose it, is my point. I think that the Biden administration is not going in with an incredible mandate. I think that because the election was so much closer than we expected, his favorables were basically underwater up until the midsummer, meaning that more people had an unfavorable view than a favorable view of him. He's not going in like Obama, where he's just a widely loved president. It was kind of more of people wanted someone other than Trump. And so for that reason, he may be a little bit more open to bipartisan and kind of consensus-seeking policies, in which school choice is certainly one of those issues. I just don't know exactly how you navigate the interest group politics that affects this. One area of potential opportunity could be looking at the increase in support for scholarships for private. I'm trying to think about the exact wording here. This is like where you offer tax advantages for individuals and businesses to donate money that go towards scholarships for students to attend private schools. And what people like, and what I've noticed, is that there's not only been a significant increase in support for that, but particularly among Democrats. And Democrats are the ones that seem to be kind of the most resistant to some of these changes. And so the fact that they have moved in favor, I think you have to look about, well, why might that be? And one is clearly the global pandemic, but also I think that people feel like scholarships being offered to students to attend private schools, they don't seem like it doesn't seem like it's taking away money that could be available for the students attending the government-run schools. So it seems more like, well, we're adding money to rather than taking money away. Yeah, so here's that great, that helpful chart.
Yeah, the conclusion from this chart is that, look, the more specific you are about the policies, whether it is general or we're talking kind of how we're spending money, and I have later slides too, again, yeah, scholarships for, based upon tax credit scholarships, which advocates know is a huge form of choice. I mean, the more specific you are, the better with Democrats, and I think subsequently also Republicans, still supported as well. So I think that's kind of the real key takeaway that, again, I think advocates are a little war weary just to totally, feel confident going into supporting this issue. I mean, we all know the teachers unions dynamics and how that certainly interplays with it. But speaking of teachers unions dynamics, I would love to get from John and Halli their take on who do they think will be the next education secretary.
Wow, you may be asking the wrong crew here. Let me rather than say who I think is going to be the next education secretary, let me just offer some thoughts on who we hope will not be the next education secretary. Obviously we would be deeply concerned, if let's say somebody like Lily Erickson would become the new education secretary, the former head of the union, the National Education Association. That would be, I think, quite troubling for education reformers around America. The reality, I think, that we have to just deal with here is obviously Joe Biden and Kamala Harris paid a lot of attention to what it was that the union was advocating for when it came to education. They both participated in the AFT's interviews of potential presidential candidates, and some of the things that they talked about, are things that are not going to, really be lighten up us education reformers. When you talk about being completely opposed to all options for kids, so no vouchers, no tax credit scholarships, no education savings accounts, very weak support for charter schools. And when I say, and I'm using support, sort of generally here, the only kind of charter schools they've indicated support for are ones that would be very, very heavily regulated. And that, that would be a problem. That would be very stifling for the charter school movement. And the Biden-Sanders education policy document was not inspiring when it came to whether they would continue the charter school program effort at the federal level, which has gone up by over $100 million during the Trump administration. I think they're up to about $430 million now. That's a really, really important program for charter schools. So when we're thinking about who the next education secretary is, I am hopeful. Well, I want to be hopeful that President-elect Biden will kind of go with his more pragmatic instincts here and recognize that with potentially a Republican Senate, with tighter margins in the House, let's try to choose somebody who may have some appeal on both sides of the aisle, who is open to this notion that families in America, not just families with means, but all families in America, particularly lower income families, ought to have, a bigger choice in where they send their child. And so I'm hopeful that they will find somebody who's a bit middle of the road on this. There's a lot of great superintendents out there. We've heard some good things about the superintendent in Baltimore. There are superintendents, people with a lot of experience in the education world, who are open to this notion of options for families. So I'm hopeful that the president-elect will defer to his more pragmatic instincts and choose somebody that has some appeal on both sides of the aisle.
Halli, you basically dedicated a significant portion of your life to helping kids get a great education, both as an educator and as an advocate. You've seen many education secretaries come and go in some sense. You mentioned one of them before from the previous administration. Do you think Biden will do the kind of conventional route of, well, at least the one that conventional wisdom is saying is going to happen, that it might be one of the leaders of the unions? Does he have an interesting pick that you've heard about or that you think might be helpful? Does he select the first lady who they've been certainly trumpeting as an educator and will keep her job there? What's your thought?
My thought is that Joe Biden is a very wise man who's been married for many years, and he's going to do the right thing and choose whoever Dr. Jill Biden tells him to do. I also think that, to be honest, before Secretary DeVos took over the office, the vast majority of Americans could never name the Secretary of Education anyway. I think to us it's a big deal, but to most people it's not. If I had my choice, I would probably put Michelle Rhee or John Bell Edwards in there. I don't think either of them probably want that position, but if I were president, God bless me, those would be my top picks.
Well, I have to, Emily, you can weigh in too, but I think to what you actually said on your final point of people wanting that position, I think given how bruising the last confirmation battle was, you have to imagine there are some senators who are eager to, or they're salivating for a bit of a fight on this one. So do you think, is there a problem where no one's raising their hand wanting to take this job? And maybe therefore that leads to the conclusion that it will be a super conventional, uncontroversial pick. Any more prognosticating from the team here on that?
I don't know. This is not my area.
Well, I'll give my brief take. I think the team probably is having a tough time getting someone who's willing and eager to go through the next few months of the process. I think there's even, if you read just kind of the newspapers, there's current folks that they've selected for other roles that are facing issues that I think they're realizing this is going to be a pretty tough process. And so given how things went last time, it might get interesting. I don't think, and we all know that conventional wisdom in politics is always correct. So what everybody's saying now is probably completely incorrect in a lot of ways, but
it's it's not, the education secretary is obviously not the highest profile position in the president's cabinet, but inevitably politics does come into play here, and if the Senate is controlled by the opposing party from the administration, inevitably the Senate is going to pick a few cabinet nominees that they're going to strenuously object to. Candidly, I hope if it's a Republican Senate, I hope they don't do, what Democrats did when President Trump was trying to get his folks nominated, which was to really drag out these nominations and, apply the Senate rules in a way that really slowed down the process. It took a long time for the Trump administration to get its cabinet secretaries placed in positions. It took a long time to get the political appointees placed, and that's harmful to government, and that's you don't want that. You want government to be able to function. So, as I said, I mean, I hope that President-elect Biden will defer to his more pragmatic instincts and really find somebody with broad appeal.
And we'll actually go to a question that we received in the chat box here that, Halli or Emily, I would love to get either of your perspective, bringing things back to the real world versus the kind of fantasy land bubble that we sometimes get into when we're talking about DC issues. Do you think that public school parents' support for school choice will remain high even after the pandemic? I'm just, whether that means it's gone or vaccine, you name it. If not, what can reformers do to maintain the support and interest? Halli, would love to kick it to you, saying, hey, look, we've got this new wave that's crested, and how do we ride it? What do you think we should do?
It's tough. I think I live in DC, and even here where 50% of the kids attend charter schools or use the voucher program, I still meet so many people who will say, oh, like I would never, I don't want to send my kid to a charter school because I believe in public schools. And I think that there's just, to be honest, such a disconnect between like what's really happening on the ground for parents and what people who are like steeped in this policy work talk about. I think, for example, practically speaking, for a lot of like Democrats, if you said, do you believe in vouchers? The answer is no. Do you think, would you like to have X amount of money per year to help you with homeschooling your kids? Absolutely, yes. I don't want to be pessimistic, but I kind of think that once the pandemic starts coming to a close and, parents with more privilege get their schools back, I don't think they're going to become like school choice converts, so to speak.
Emily, you've studied a number of issues, seen ebbs and flows of things. Do you think that, hey, if there was a robust advocacy plan on our side of things with advocates reaching out to parents, engaging them, do you think that support can be maintained? Is this just a blip and kind of just a totally unbelievably unique circumstance? Give us your take.
So I tend to agree with Halli. That this is probably more of an ephemeral. Certain aspects of this are ephemeral. The polling that you measure may continue to show, this it might follow this trajectory in support for school choice and scholarships for students to attend the school of their choice and things like that. But I think this anecdote that I'm thinking about really kind of encapsulates how a lot of parents think. I have a relative who was opposed to school choice. She thought that it was unfair to take money away from government-run schools, and that's how she perceived the issue, even though school choice advocates would quibble with that. And then a couple years later, I noticed she had a sign in her yard that was advocating for school choice. And I asked what had happened. Well, I can tell you what it was. Yeah. She had 2 kids, and one of them needed to be in private school for some issues that he had that would be better served through a particular private school. And I asked, what changed? I mean, you were so opposed to private school. And this person said, well, now I know why it's so important. It's funny how that works, right? And so I kind of think that on this issue, a lot of the time, it's a lot easier for people to empathize with those who are in desperate need to find a school that fits the needs of their kids. It's hard to find empathy for that if it's not your situation. I've certainly seen lots of cases where people send their own kids to private schools, but then think that everyone else's kids should go to the school based on their zip code. And that's just kind of how things are. And so as a consequence, just knowing that about human nature, just knowing that's how we can be as human beings, that you want to take, make the most of the opportunity that you have right now, which is right now, people on the ground need help. They need something different. The current situation is not working for many, many, many people and their kids. And so now is the opportunity to offer them something new, a choice. And if they have a chance to actually experience that difference, they might want to keep it. And that's where I think you get the lasting effect. If you want a lasting effect, that, you know, these trends that we're seeing, if you want it to last, you have to actually offer these parents and their kids the actual experience of attending a charter school or a private school or something like that. But if they don't get that taste and things go back to normal and they go back to their schools as they are, you're just not going to have nearly as much support. And when teacher unions and other special interest groups push back against reform, you know, parents aren't going to resist nearly as much if things are back to normal. So I think if things are, now is, I think, the time to try to move things forward, because you have a very unique opportunity.
Yeah, Emily makes a really great point. Once you get a taste of it, and one of the things that we've learned over many years in doing this work is, you know, once families actually get into these programs, that's what has a way of influencing policymakers, because once they're in, they want to stay in, and more families want to get in. And then you put politicians in the position of taking away people's options, and that's really problematic. I want to be bullish on this. I want to say that this really is a moment, and that we can sustain this going forward. But I have to tell you, if we're going to really seize this moment, take advantage of this window of opportunity, it is incumbent upon groups like AFC and our national and state allies around the country to harness, you know, the energy that parents of school-age children have right now for additional choices. This is going to be up to us. This is going to be our work, particularly in the states, to try to get governors and state legislatures to really put their foot on the gas and take advantage of this opportunity. And that now is our moment.
And John, related to that, we actually got a tactical question in saying, hey, look, normally all of our work is at the state level. How do we as state partners start viewing engagement at the federal level? I mean, you talked about how there's new negotiations on kind of a COVID, you know, next round of stimulus package, essentially. You know, should advocates be engaging with their federal, you know, delegation right now at the state level, urging them to support this, you know, in this time of crisis and need?
Well, look, most of the action, as we all know, is in the states. That's where most of the money is. That's where most of the funding is. The federal government, there is going to be federal money. The spigot is not going to be turned off. And what we want to make sure that we do with federal money is to make sure that we are channeling this in the most responsible direction that we can. And as education reformers, look, we've always known that the system needs more flexibility and choice. And to the degree that we can leverage federal money to more directly empower families in the states, we ought to be doing that. So, you know, this is, to me, we ought to be working on parallel tracks. Most of the action is going to be in the states, but we can't forget that at the federal level, there's about $70 billion available, and we ought to be trying to channel that in the right direction.
I would also add, as I've been sitting here thinking, to your point, Emily, about, you know, just thinking about how can we engage parents who might not have supported school choice previously to think about it differently now. You know, as we all know, during this pandemic, one of the major things that's happened was George Floyd was killed, and then there was this whole like uprising of consciousness around you know, civil rights for Black Americans in particular, and as we all know, the majority of kids in charter schools, the majority of kids who use, you know, publicly funded scholarship programs are low-income kids of color. And so for me, as someone who's like more progressive in my politics, like that's why I believe in school choice, is because I believe that like low-income families, families of color, deserve access to excellent schools, and these programs can provide that. And so, you know, I would hope that as more like white progressives are getting woke, so to speak, that's school choice is something that they can at least warm up to as a matter of social justice.
Yeah, and related to that, Halli, actually, we got a comment in from a person who is a voucher recipient himself, and has claimed that that opportunity changed his life completely. You know, he said, based upon the polling, you know, support for education freedom, I mean, it's not political in some sense. So, you know, we have a couple minutes left here. Would love to leave on an optimistic note of where we think, look, the polling's in our favor. We have this moment in time that's, I mean, never happened before. We're all somewhat 60 million children were relegated to either a Zoom schooling environment. We have headwinds in so many states where, you know, AFC, with all of our work in the elections alongside our partners, we did tremendously well to set the table for the upcoming legislative sessions, you know, and then thinking back to whether it's the parents or the students that we're serving, we have huge opportunities here. So, Halli, if you want to leave, you know, give us your sense of where you think you're most optimistic going forward. I may have just, you know, completely teed this one up as a softball, but we'd love to hear where you're feeling good, and we can do a quick round robin with everybody. Where else you're feeling good at this moment in the movement? Halli, we'll start with you.
Okay, you should have prepared me to talk about something I'm feeling good about.
It doesn't come naturally.
So this is cheesy, but this is the truth. Like, my daughter's 10 months old, and she really loves singing. And like, anytime I sing a silly song, like her whole face lights up. And she also has a very low tolerance for things that she doesn't like. And I feel like I'm really excited about like this generation of kids that are coming up. I think they're bright and brilliant. I think I'll speak for myself, like in the areas that I become jaded and I've just accepted as like politics as usual in education policy. I think there's a whole new generation of leaders coming up, a lot of them who have used school choice themselves, that don't take no for an answer, don't accept politics as usual, see that education policy is not a partisan issue. So I'm just really excited for them to start like taking charge and really creating new cool stuff.
John?
Well, I like Halli's sentiments here.
Oh no, we lost John right as he's getting into the good stuff. Well, we'll go to Emily. Where do you feel optimistic, even though you're
back? Sorry.
Oh, John's back. We got him.
Oh, I'm sorry. They kept asking me if I was still here, and I said yes. Look, I've been working on this issue for 23 years, and what I've always loved about working on educational choice is that it's about the kids. And I've always felt, and in fact, Tommy, as you know, our polling bears this out. You know, this is an issue, unlike a lot of issues that can bring people together. And it's not a liberal issue. It's not a conservative issue. It's not a Democrat issue. It's not a Republican issue. It's about kids. And I think if we in the education reform movement stay focused on that and remember that, there is no limit to what we can accomplish. I believe the glass is half full.
Emily, you've got about 30 seconds. We'd love to hear your take. Oh, you're on mute for the moment.
I'm going to just quickly reiterate what we already saw in the polling. I think that there are some very optimistic trends in the polling data. I think that the experiences of many American families right now are leading them to see the benefits of school choice. And so I think they're going to be far more receptive to change and to reform right now. And so I think that there's just a lot to be excited about in that area.
Yeah, as to the polling, it's something I almost conclude at every polling presentation I do. We have a winning issue. We have a winning message. We just need to tell it. We need to get it out there. In some sense, it's a marketing issue of just getting the message out, talking to more families, as Halli talked about, John, you've been in this fight for forever. You've seen where that's been impactful. So I'm feeling very optimistic. I think this is the most exciting chapter in our movement's history ahead, and looking forward to keeping up the fight with everybody here on this call. But we're about to get kicked off in 10 seconds. So thank you all for joining us today. Hope you have a good rest of the day and rest of the EdPalooza.